Hello, welcome to the video tutorial on multiplicative inverse. So this is a continuation of the learning target. I can solve and interpret equations using properties, like terms, and factoring for one-step equations. We're going to start solving for one-step equations that involve multiplication and division rather than addition and subtraction. So the point that we want to make sure is very clear for everybody is that whenever we are isolating the variable, it's the inverse operation that we're focusing on, not necessarily the opposite of the number, but the operation. So when we're doing multiplicative inverse, we're actually trying to get the coefficients and the constants away from the variable, and we're trying to get it to 1, not to 0. I'll explain what that means in just a second. But let's review what you already know. You've already learned this. So let's look at this example here. Let's go back to what we call the additive inverse. This involves addition and subtraction. So I have to actually get rid of this 2 here to isolate the variable d. How do I get rid of a positive 2? I do the opposite of a positive 2, which is a negative 2. Okay. And if I do a negative 2 on one side, I have to do a negative 2 to the other side to keep it balanced. So with equations, everything has to stay balanced. So we have 2 minus 2 plus d is equal to 5 minus 2. And this process eliminates the 2's with the d, leaves d alone, and that shows that that's equal to 5 minus 2, which is 3. On the right side, we have another example. Notice how in this case, I'm trying to get rid of a negative 2. I still want to get d alone, so same process. And to get rid of a negative 2, I do a positive 2. So I put a plus 2 on one side. Whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do the same thing to the other, so I put a plus 2 on that side. So I have negative 2 plus 2 plus d is equal to 5 plus 2. And again, the whole reason for this was so that those 2's go to 0, and I'm left with d is equal to 5 plus 2, which is 7. So this is solved for d. So when we're doing additive inverse, we're trying to cancel out the constants and get them to 0. But now we're going to start doing multiplication and division. Let's clear this out. And let's look at the examples below. So let's look at just A. Notice in this case, I've got x, and it's not being added or subtracted by 2. It's being divided by 2. So this line here means division, right? So x divided by 2 is equal to 11. So what does x have to be equal to? Well, what is the inverse operation of division? The answer is multiplication. So to isolate the variable x in this case, I'm going to show multiplication of the operation. And what am I going to multiply by? The number that I'm dividing by. So to cancel out x divided by 2, I'm going to do x multiplied by 2. So this is basically what happens. And by the way, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other, right? So I better multiply the other side by 2 as well. So this is what you get. You've got 2 times x divided by 2, right? This is what we had here, 2 times x divided by 2. And then on the right, you have 11 times 2. Okay. Well, this is nice because what happens to a 2 when you divide by itself? Any number divided by itself, 2 divided by 2, for instance, just equals 1. So these go to 1. And if I have 1x here, it's just the same as just writing x. So just 1x, right? And 1x times is equal to 11 times 2. So 11 times 2 is just 22. So in other words, the answer is x is equal to 22. And you can test that by taking 22 into x. 22 divided by 2 is equal to 11. Well, let's look at the example on the right now. So we've got w. It's not being added or subtracted. This time it's actually being multiplied. So what's the inverse operation? What's the inverse operation of multiplication? The answer is division. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide. What am I going to divide by? The same number that's being multiplied by w. So I put division right here. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So I put division there as well. Now, so basically I have I've got 4 divided by 4 times w. That's equal to 80 divided by 4. 80 divided by 4 should be 20. So basically, what happens to a 4 divided by 4? What happens to any number divided by itself? That just goes to 1. So I'm left with 1w is equal to 20. Or in other words, just w. The answer is w is equal to 20. And I'm done. We're going to have you guys try a few. So let's look at this example. Go ahead and try it on your own. Okay, so this is division. And similar to the example we just saw up here, to undo division, we do multiplication. It gets a little tricky because this is a -2. So I have to undo division with multiplication. So I put parentheses because this is how we show multiplication in math from the 7th grade and above. And I'm going to put outside of it. So x is being divided by -2, so I better multiply by a -2. A common mistake that students will make is they will want to do the opposite of the sign. But remember, we're trying to do the opposite of the operation, not the sign. So a lot of kids would multiply both sides by +2. We don't want to do that. We want to multiply both sides by -2 because this is a -2. So basically what we have is -2 times x, and that whole thing is being divided by -2. And I'm left with, whatever I do to one side, I better do to the other. So I'm going to show multiplication using parentheses. And I know, so what's 11 times -2? Well, 11 times 2 is 22, and a positive times a negative is a negative. So my answer should be -22 here. And I just have to figure out, okay, x is equal to -22. What happens to these two numbers, these -2's? Well, a -2 divided by -2 just goes to 1. And I'm left with x is equal to -22. Alright, go ahead and try this example on your own. Okay, so let's go a little bit faster here. Here we go. This is multiplication. To undo multiplication, I have to divide. And I'm going to divide by the same number that I multiplied by. So I'm going to divide by -4. And whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So this process will automatically produce the answer because I've got -4 divided by -4. That goes to 1. So I'm left with 1w. And that equals 80 divided by -4. A positive divided by a negative should be a negative. And the answer is -20. Alright, these are the last two examples. Try them on your own. Okay, so I will show you two different ways to think about this. The first way you can think about this is the idea that a number outside of a variable is multiplication. What's the inverse operation of multiplication? It's division. I could divide both sides by 1/2. So basically what I have here is I've got 1/2 divided by 1/2 multiplied by x, right? And that equals 11 divided by 1/2 here. Okay, I'll just put it that way. Any number divided by itself goes to 1. So I'm left with x is equal to, well, what's 11 divided by 1/2? It should be 22. Okay. The other way you can think of this is you could actually simplify this a little bit. See, 1/2 times x is the same thing as 1/2 times x over 1, which simplifies to x over 2. So you could write this as x over 2 is equal to 11. And this looks a lot like the example we just did, not this one, but the one just above that, where this is just division. And what do I do with division? I multiply. So I can multiply both sides by 2. And so I have basically 2 over 2 times x is equal to 22, and those just go to 1. And notice how I'm getting the same answer here. I'm getting the same. So this is 2 different ways to think of it. Yeah. All right, last one. This one can get a little tricky. There's 2 different ways you can think of this one as well. There's actually many ways you can think of this one. One way is that you could just break this down into small groups. So you could try to tackle the division first, and then tackle the multiplication later. That way it gets a little messy. I like to think of this as just, this is a negative 4/3. And I like a negative 4/3 times w better. Like, it looks like this. So negative 4/3 times w is equal to 80. Because I know how to get rid of a multiplication. I can just, okay, that's multiplication. What's the inverse of multiplication? It's division. So I could just divide both sides by negative 4/3. Whoops. Okay. Anyway, so this goes to 1, and I'm left with w is equal to 80 divided by negative 4/3. And that should be, you can use your calculator if you want to, but it should be a negative 60. So that's my answer. Okay. There's lots of different ways to think about solving for variables with multiplication division, especially when dealing with fractions. I'd show you more, but this video is already running a bit long, so we'll pause here, and then maybe I'll make an additional video if you want to see other ways to think of it. Hopefully this is helpful. Have a good day.